That evidence is continuing to mount, and one can envision a day, and it might not be this year or next, but someday when Syria will be held accountable in some way before the world.
That's the voice of author and journalist Joby Warrick. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kuldina.
Welcome back to Press the Button. This was the voice of our guest announcer, Karim Kamel, a nuclear expert and longtime listener who turned tables with our communications director, Delphine Vigil. It's always great to have new voices on the podcast. But getting into this week's nuclear news, Tom, what do you have lined up for us on Early Warning?
Hey, Michelle, great to have you back. Hope you enjoyed your time off. The Biden administration has unveiled its North Korea strategy review, and it is provoking more questions than answers. On Early Warning, we'll look at the new policy and discuss what it might mean, how it differs from previous administrations, and what might be next for U.S.-North Korean engagement. So please tune in.
After that, I sit down with Joby Warrick, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist who has worked for the Washington Post for several decades, covering the Middle East, diplomacy, and national security. We sit down to talk about his new book, Red Line, The Unraveling of Syria and America's Race to Destroy the Most Dangerous Arsenal in the World. The book tells the story of the U.S.'s work and the global effort to destroy Syria's chemical weapons and keep them out of the hands of the Islamic State. Joby reconstructed the key decision points as well as the unprecedented international effort to remove these chemical weapons. And he tells us how this historic undertaking deprived Assad of the bulk of his nerve agents and production equipment and prevented what might have been a catastrophic leakage of deadly nerve agents to Syrian combatants and terrorist groups. It's a great story of multilateral success that you won't want to miss.
If you like what you hear, as always, please remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Every little bit helps to grow our show and our audience, and we really do appreciate it. And with that, let's get to today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, Early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
The Biden administration rolled out its North Korea strategy review last week, which seeks to solve one of the most difficult national security challenges in the world today. Indeed, the Obama administration achieved little with its policy of strategic patience, and while the Trump administration met with North Korea multiple times at high-level summits, President Trump failed to make a deal. Meanwhile, the North Korean nuclear arsenal has continued to grow. The Biden administration says its new policy is somewhere in between Obama's and Trump's, and that its goal will be to, quote, pursue a phased agreement that leads to full denuclearization, unquote, of the Korean Peninsula. But what does this really mean? Here to help us understand all this is Jessica Lee. She is a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute. Jess, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Great to be with you.
So, Jess, how would you describe Biden's North Korea policy, and how does it differ from that of the Obama and Trump administrations?
Yeah, I mean, we're still piecing together, like you said, as we learned from the Biden administration, what the policy will look like. Back in April 30th, when the White House press secretary, Jen Psaki, announced that the North Korea policy review has ended, she alluded to some sort of a middle path away from a grand bargain that President Trump sought in Hanoi and away from strategic patience that, largely guided the Obama era toward some sort of a more middle of the road path. The same day, the Washington Post, of course, also had an article that cited an anonymous senior official saying that they don't think that what they're contemplating is likely going to forestall or stop provocation from the North, which was sobering, and that they also intend to maintain sanctions fully while this all plays out. And then, of course, there was a second official in the same article that said that, the Biden administration's approach would, quote, build on the Singapore Declaration and other previous agreements. So to your question, what does this all mean? I think there are certainly some elements of this yet to be announced strategy that sound very welcoming. Certainly a, quote, calibrated, practical approach to diplomacy is music to my ear, having written about, the need for more of a phased approach to negotiating with North Korea. And then, of course, the building upon the Singapore agreement is another very positive sign as well. In fact, on March 5th, Quincy Institute signed a letter with 10 other national organizations that called on the Biden administration to build confidence and mutual trust, in part by upholding the Singapore agreement that was signed by President Trump and Kim Jong-un. And I've also written at the Quincy Institute about the need for a dual track approach of building peace and tension reduction toward a long-term goal of denuclearization. So, on one hand, there's very little detail about how flexible the Biden administration will be on this issue. Will it merely go through the motion of engaging with North Korea, or really do the work to reach a deal and take some risks? So, I think there are questions like that, I'm certainly going to be asking. And, I think we will have to see, how much, the United States is willing to break the deadlock in talks and offer some things that could really set in motion a very different type of bilateral relationship.
So do we know enough yet to know whether there's promise of this working, or is it still just too early to know?
I think it's too early to know. And, I think there are a lot of unknowns. For example, what is the Congress's response going to be? It's possible, even likely, that hawks in Congress will not want to see much progress in this area. And they can do a lot of things to make it very difficult for the Biden administration to make progress. So, I think it remains to be seen both what the policy will be and how key players in Washington will respond.
Despite what we think the Biden policy might be, what do you think President Biden should do, and what should happen next?
Well, I think once the policy is announced, there will be much scrutiny and criticism by folks who, will say that it doesn't go far enough or that it goes way too far and that we are giving too much. So I think one of the things that the Biden administration has to really take into account right now before it announces its policy is to figure out who its validators are going to be. It's going to need some support, not just from senior officials and, the military brass, but community folks too, opinion makers, thought leaders. And I think he's going to have to really, rely on them to explain to the public why his policy that seems to be really geared toward transforming bilateral relations and breaking away from this negative cycle of threats and pressure is the best way to advance U.S.'s interests and also reduce North Korea's threat. And so I think, what that really means specifically is going to be, reaching out to folks before the policy is announced. Think tanks, advocacy groups, humanitarian organizations, veterans groups, Korean American groups, many groups are out there actually, working on this issue and would be, I think, broadly speaking, very supportive of any diplomacy-centered North Korea policy. And, they have well-informed, well-organized staff and communications capacity to really help, build a narrative that, in the 21st century, U.S.-North Korea relations is still deeply outdated. And that if we continue on this path, that, we're going to be risking a deadly confrontation.
The cynical side of me thinks this sounds a lot like a wait-and-see policy, not so dissimilar from strategic patience. What is your sense of that?
I think, there is a part of me that is frustrated that, we don't have enough sort of bold, transformative thinking. As I quoted earlier, this notion that we will maintain sanctions throughout this process, I think bodes very badly. At the same time, it's possible that the administration just simply doesn't feel that it has enough political capital to fight the internal battle in government to, even partially lift some of these sanctions, something that China and Russia has advocated at the UN Security Council, because it would just be too much of an uphill battle. I happen to think that there's much broader support for removing these sanctions that have been in the books for years without any sunset clauses. And I think there's a strong argument to be made there for why that's necessary. But at the end of the day, we need to figure out, okay, what does the North Koreans, what do they want? Are we going to be negotiating with ourselves, or are we actually going to bring them back to the table? And there are certain things, as you're alluding to, Tom, that we know they want, that they wanted in Hanoi. Partial sanctions relief is chiefly among them. So, we have to learn from our history, learn from the most recent negotiations, and really figure out what sort of leverages we're willing to use in order to make more progress.
Jessica Lee with the Quincy Institute, thank you so much for being here, and best of luck with your work.
Thank you, Tom.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Warner, and I'm the Managing Director of Plowshares Fund. Even though I've been working in the nuclear field for nearly 9 years, there is still so much to learn. That's why I'm a dedicated listener of Press the Button. I so appreciate each episode where I can get the top stories of the week and a deeper dive into critical conversations with thought leaders and experts in nuclear policy and national security. I'm also a proud supporter of Plowshares Fund. Did you know that many of the guests featured on Press the Button are supported by Plowshares? Since our founding 40 years ago, all of our work is made possible by individuals just like you. Curious, committed, passionate. If you like what you're hearing on Press the Button and want to support the work of Plowshares Fund, please donate today. Whether it's $5, $50, $500, your generosity helps create a safer future free from the threat of nuclear weapons. Visit plowshares.org today to make a donation. Or join me and make it monthly. Whatever you do, stay informed, stay safe, and stay connected. Together, we can create a world where nuclear weapons can never be used again. Thank you for listening.
A two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, Joby Warrick is an award-winning author and a national security correspondent for The Washington Post. In more than 2 decades as a Washington Post reporter, he has written on topics ranging from Middle East conflicts and terrorism to nuclear proliferation and climate change. His journalism career before that included co-authoring a Pulitzer Prize-winning series about factory farming in the Southeast for the News and Observer of Raleigh, North Carolina, and time as a foreign correspondent for the United Press International in Eastern Europe. He has written 3 books, including the best-selling The Triple Agent, about a CIA operation in Afghanistan, Black Flags, a narrative account of the rise of the Islamic State, and recipient of the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. And today I've invited him on to discuss his third and most recent book, Red Line, The Unraveling of Syria and America's Race to Destroy the Most Dangerous Arsenal in the World. Joby, welcome to the show.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You tell the stories behind this incredible effort to dismantle Syrian chemical weapons and hold the Syrian government accountable for its actions. There's a few separate storylines from how the U.S. developed the technology and the plan to destroy the Syrian stockpile, the international effort led by the UN and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to actually remove the stockpile from Syria, the efforts at accountability in the UN, and ISIS's use of chemical weapons on the battlefield. But what ties all these stories together are the stories from Syrians and Kurds who were the victims of the attacks or who risked their lives to treat victims or gather evidence. Now, a huge congratulations are in order for your work. I mean, the details are astounding. What drew you to the topic?
Well, again, thank you for having me. It's not a story that I think people would open up to and think, wow, I really want to read that initially. But as you said, it's in the details. And throughout my career, I've actually spent a lot of time and effort covering terrorism, the Middle East, and weapons of mass destruction. And here is a story that brings all those elements together in a remarkable way. As a storyteller, it was truly fascinating and compelling. But it's also, chilling as an observer, where you have a situation where the Middle East is on fire, literally, because of Arab Spring and all the civil, uprisings and then fighting that takes place. And in the middle of all that, you have one country that has a real weapon of mass destruction. Syria is home to hundreds of tons of chemical weapons and the really bad stuff, sarin, nerve agents, VX, the things that we worry most about. And it's in a country that's being torn apart by civil war. And so, to me, to try to understand how we got in that predicament, how we dealt with it, this being this one moment in this 10-year conflict where the world briefly got together and decided to do something, proactive about this one issue at least. And then how logistically it became possible to remove this stockpile in the middle of a war, which has never happened before in history, and almost didn't happen at all. And to put that all together with the stories of Syrians who were on the ground and really risking their lives to sort of bring the evidence to the outside world and to agitate for a solution. And all that just made it irresistible to me. And I just felt that I had to tell this story, and I'm just thrilled that I had the opportunity to do it.
So over the course of the research and your interviews, what surprised you the most?
Well, there are really two big surprises. One was what a close call this was, because as I mentioned, there are big stockpiles of bad stuff in a country that's at war. And by late 2012, certainly early 2013, you have some very bad actors on the scene. So, this group al-Nusra, which is really an al-Qaeda organization, has begun to take over territory. They're knocking off military bases and convoys. I remember covering the conflict back in those days, and every few weeks there'd be some military base that this group would seize, and then they would show video of all the stuff they had, all the weapons they had acquired. But they came very close to knocking off a facility that had some of this material. And then later on, when ISIS, arises in the eastern part of the country, they have their designs on this stuff too. So there are at least two incidents over the course of my story in which some very worrisome people came very close to being able to steal some stuff, and even a few gallons of sarin taking in, out of the country, by truck into Turkey or into Europe could have been a catastrophic, outcome. But the other near miracle that I was shocked to kind of learn about was the sort of the details about how the stuff was brought out of the country and what happened to it. And once we had an agreement with Russia to disarm Syria, to take the material out of the country, the way that came together and, against all odds, succeeded, at least in to the extent that we were able to get declared material out of Syria, was absolutely just breathtaking to me. And to be able to recount how it happened was just a lot of fun. And I just think it's a really great yarn.
Were people willing to talk? I mean, was this something that you had to really convince people to tell you this story? Or was it kind of, once you started with one person, it led to another? What was that like? I mean, we typically think of WMD as being very secretive.
You're right. And some parts are actually really, really hard to get. So the story starts out with a spy tale, which is, actually had never been told before. But it's a story about a CIA spy inside Syria's chemical program that became just invaluable to us and just brought out all kinds of information, even a sample. And so that, you can imagine, was just really, really hard to penetrate. It took a lot of work. But I found that some of the other stuff, some of the, inside the agencies, inside, the Pentagon, people who put together the plan to get the chemicals out and destroy them, they took part in what was, for some of them, the most important mission of their lives. And it happened in a flash in historical terms. People were completely obsessed or, distracted by other things going on in the world. There was the Ukraine crisis. ISIS was just starting to really emerge in Syria. So people didn't really pay attention. And the people who really achieved this, I think some of them did really want the story told. And so I ended up having a lot of success in terms of connecting with people who were on the ground, who knew, how hard it was and just how difficult it was to pull off. And they had the most amazing stories of all. And I really enjoyed being able to relate their experiences to a wider audience. And I hope people enjoy it.
Now, the effort to hold Syria accountable is still ongoing. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons suspended Syria, given its non-compliance and non-cooperation. Do you think the international community will be able to truly hold Syria accountable or find some measure of justice for its victims?
That's a really big question, and it's a very important question to me, because it does seem at the moment, we're talking in April of 2021, that Assad, the president of Syria, has gotten away with this, that he used chemical weapons against his own people. He was embarrassed and had to give up a key part of his arsenal. But other than that, he wasn't really held accountable. To this day, he's never had to admit to using chemical weapons against his own people. He always denies it. Russia supports him. At the UN, any action that's meaningful is always blocked by Russia. But there is a process, and we're starting to see some successes with the OPCW, this organization in The Hague that essentially is the world policeman for chemical weapons use, is finally putting together a forensic file that shows without doubt that Syria is behind many of these attacks. I think people kind of knew it all along, but here's the hard evidence, and Syria is being forced to confront it and also pay at least some price in terms of this. We just saw them lose some of their rights and privileges as members of the OPCW's Chemical Weapons Convention. So little things at first, but that evidence is continuing to mount. And one can envision a day, and it might not be this year or next, but someday when Syria will be held accountable in some way before the World Court or before the UN. If Assad is out of power, there's a potential for prosecutions. And it does take place, over a long period of time. Sometimes we saw this, in the Balkans conflict in the 90s. It took 20 years for some of those people to see justice. And I think it's important not to give up, not to think that just because time has passed that it's not relevant anymore, but to keep pushing that boulder up the hill to hopefully one day see that Syrian victims have their moment of justice.
Now, you mentioned this about, putting together this file of truth that demonstrates what actually happened. And what I found really striking in the story of the Syrian chemical weapons is the amount of disinformation and the way those stories were, told to try to obscure what actually happened. How did that affect your research, and how do you see that playing kind of this ongoing role in finding a resolution?
It was a bit mystifying in a way to see how this, things that look pretty clear and pretty provable were being denied, and sort of false narratives being created by the Syrians and then by the Russians, and people believing them. And not just, people who would normally be in Russia's camp on these things, but there's sort of a community of activists who would embrace these false storylines and to this day argue that Assad was a good guy. Syria would never have used chemical weapons. These are just an attempt to smear him by the West or to create a pretense for a war. And, I don't think any of the people involved in this story are agitating for a conflict, but they just want truth to prevail and to have to not just have the difficulties and challenges of finding evidence, but then having themselves being shouted down by this chorus of deniers and by these false narratives that are floating around out there. For me personally, I felt that I had to confront them. I had to make sure I understood the arguments and understood what the evidence that was being offered by the other side, what it really consisted of. But it doesn't take very long to see that it's quite thin. And then if you really examine the forensic detail and which, who's flying helicopters over this town in Syria in 2014 and had the ability to drop chemical munitions. It's a set of one. So the arguments being proffered by these groups are quite absurd when you begin to look at it. But it is part of the environment we're in now, that we don't just have to report the truth as best we can determine it, but we also have to fight against these terrific fables that are created by groups that really want to promote their own cause or have their own motivations.
Coming back to the title, Red Line, you reflect in the book on what approaches both Presidents Obama and Trump took to resolving the crisis. Obama's emphasis on diplomacy, Trump's decision to fire cruise missiles, and what those decisions meant for ridding the world of these weapons and stopping their use. What lessons do you hope policymakers take from this crisis?
That's a really good question. And it's something I wrestle with in the book, and I've wrestled with personally. There's all kinds of reasons why force is sometimes used in trying to resolve these kinds of conflicts. But when it comes to eliminating a weapon of mass destruction, that's a different issue. So if that's your objective, if your objective is to get rid of stockpiles of WMD, often, military attacks are just not the solution. And that's what Obama's folks discovered as they're wrestling with the problem in 2013 of what to do about these chemical weapons attacks. The proposal was made, why don't we blow them up? Why don't we just, send missiles into Syria and destroy their arsenals? You can't do that with chemical weapons. You can't do it because you're just going to spread them. It's going to create, a sarin cloud, and you're going to kill people instead of saving them. And so that's not something you can do. The diplomatic solution that arises in 2013, as imperfect as it was, and it is imperfect because we didn't get everything, because we didn't change Assad's intent. He continued to want to use chemical weapons and continued to do so. But eliminating that 1,300-ton stockpile got rid of most of his capability, as well as production equipment, his manufacturing equipment, all the stuff that was vital to making more chemical weapons. That stuff was broken up and destroyed. And that was a real achievement. By contrast, you can see what Trump did in 2017 and 2018, two different occasions when he responded to chemical attacks with military strikes. We didn't really achieve very much. We destroyed a few airplanes, damaged a runway that was up and fixed and running again the next day. But Assad's intention was never changed because he went on and used chemical weapons again. And so it wasn't really a deterrent. It didn't destroy stockpiles. And so from a WMD point of view, it didn't achieve very much. Diplomacy was the thing that actually proved to be much more successful in that regard. So
for our listeners, where can they go to find your book?
So it's out everywhere. So it came out in late February, and it's all the major book vendors. If you go to my website, I've got one now. It's jobywarrick.com, and I list all the places where you can buy them. But I also would have to say that if you like audiobooks, as I do, there's a terrific narrated version of the story by a great actor. And if you're so inclined, you can check that out at your library or get it from Audible. It's a really terrific listening experience, I find.
Joby, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. As I started my research in preparation, I heard from several people that you are not only one of the smartest, but also one of the kindest people they have come across in this field. So I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk more about your book.
Well, that's a great compliment. And really enjoyed being on the show. Wish you lots of luck.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Derek Zander, Will Lowry, and Delphine Vihili, with research and assistance from Doreen Horschig and Harry Tarpey. Sound design by Derek Zander. Audio engineering by Derek Zander and Delphine Vihili. Our theme song is by Lyrics, Born and the Poets of Rhythm. Sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.